former US Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, even called for the BIS to be completely liquidated. And he felt so strongly about it because he thought that the BIS was actually collaborating with the Nazi Germany, that they were
Yeah.
funding the Third Reich. And so he said that effectively this quasi-international entity without, any moral or ethical constraints has no right to exist.
By virtue of right now, as we're seeing, trading with Israel. Like, does that make you guilty? Now, and now you might get a little bit more of the flavor of this. If you say yes, you might immediately be accused of anti-Semitism. If you say if you say no, you might immediately be accused of wanting to kill Palestinians, right? So it's that kind of problem that you then land in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I have a fantastic guest today, Dr. Pascal Lota. Pascal is a professor for neutrality studies at Kyoto University in Japan, where Pascal specializes on neutral actors in international relations, especially on neutrality during the two world wars and during the Cold War. He recently published several great books, including Sweden, Japan, and the Long Second World War, and Permanent Neutrality, a model for peace, security, and justice. Also, I have to say that Pascal is a fellow YouTuber. He runs one of my absolute favorite channels on geopolitics called Neutrality Studies. I have to admit that Neutrality Studies is my go-to channel on a daily basis, and you will find it linked below. Please do subscribe for excellent, timely, and spot-on analysis of current events. Today, Pascal and I will discuss who is behind the rapid development of central bank digital currencies around the world. As I frequently discuss on my channel, CBDCs will end privacy and freedom as we know it. Specifically, we will discuss the role of the Bank for International Settlements that is running the show. Pascal, welcome. Thank you very much for joining today.
Hello, Lena, and thank you very much for having me.
I would like to start with something that I'm personally very, very interested in, and I would love to get your insights. First, I would like to dive deeper into the history of the Bank for International Settlements so that our viewers can understand just how unique and unprecedented this private entity is. At the moment, there are 130 countries that are exploring CBDCs, and that represents 98% of global GDP. It's incredible. What's even more shocking, according to the Atlantic Council, a new record high of 64 countries are now in the advanced phases of CBDC exploration. So, hearing that data, it becomes really clear that there is something going on behind the scenes. There must be a centralized entity that is sort of coordinating the process, starting with developing the framework for CBDCs and then ending with when these CBDCs will be piloted and eventually fully launched. So, as it turns out, a private quasi-international entity, the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS for short, has played a key role in the process for developing CBDCs. And it has been in the shadows since the 1930s, even though it is, as defined in its charter, a central bank for all global central banks. Pascal, first, I would like to understand what was the purpose for establishing the BIS, and is there anybody, an entity, or a group of individuals who regulate it?
Well, the BIS is one of the most interesting international institutions that never get actually a light shown on them. It's physically located in Basel, Switzerland. I mean, I am from a different canton in Switzerland, but if you ever go to Basel, right outside the station, right outside, there's this big tower, and that's the BIS, the headquarter. Um, and the way it was created, why it is called Bank for International Settlements, is because it was conceived originally as an institution to regulate the First World War um, settlement payments from Germany to other states. Germany lost the First World War. It didn't lose it the same way that it lost the Second World War, right? The Second World War was completely bombed out, and Berlin was burned, and Hitler killed himself in the bunker. The First World War was completely different. Germany had no soldier on its soil. It just basically collapsed. It lost the ability to fight the war after 4 years. But its soldiers like wreaked havoc on other countries, including France and so on. And those countries then forced Germany to accept to pay reparations. And the people who did that, interestingly, thought that it would be a good idea to make the payments of these reparations um, through not through one of the countries that fought the war, but through a separate institution. And it took a long time, actually. The First World War ended in 1918. And then the BIS, the Bank for International Settlement, was only founded 12 years later in 1930. But its primary purpose then was to regulate these payments. But that was only one purpose. The people who founded it, which were the governors of several central banks, they immediately added a second purpose to it, which was the settlement of central bank payments among themselves. And within basically a year or two, the first purpose was suspended because of the 1929 financial crisis. Only the second purpose of doing settlements remained, and that's until today. I mean, the BIS, to my knowledge, doesn't do any kind of settlements anymore. Actually, Germany kept paying until I think 2009 payments for the First World War, but this ended, or something around there. And by now, the BIS central role is to do settlements among the central banks. And we need to talk about this because this mechanic is very, very important. And the second purpose is that it also functions as something of a think tank for central banks. You have a lot of people who then produce a lot of policy papers and research papers, and they meet. It's also a meeting ground for central bankers and retail bankers to a certain degree, of course. And when I say the difference between central bank and retail bank is the central bank is the bank in each country that has the power to print money. Every country has one, but only one, except for the United States, which has a reserve network, basically. But it's still like the principle is the same. It's one entity that has the power to print money, and retail banks are normal banks that you and I we use. Like what is the Bank of America, all of the different banks you can think of. Yeah, and that's maybe about the history of the BIS. And one more thing that is important is that the way that it was created, because you also asked about supervision, is that the central bankers of like France, England, Germany, several others got together and founded this thing. And then they asked Switzerland to host it because they didn't want it in one of the big countries, in one of the major powers. They said we need a small neutral one that takes care of it. And they actually asked it, can you please give it extraterritorial rights, so that it's not regulated. It's not actually incorporated under Swiss law. It's separate from it, and the Swiss police and the Swiss military has no right to go in there. And in 1936, that was even made into a little treaty. So the BIS exists, legally speaking, very similar to the way that the United Nations exists, right? In New York, you have the United Nations, the headquarter, but that headquarter has a host country agreement with the United States, which makes it not part of US soil. And when Mr. Lavrov goes there, he has the right to go there as a Russian, even though the Americans right now hate the Russians. But he has the right to go there because it's not part of the United States, and it's part of the agreement that everybody can meet there. And similarly for the BIS, it's in Switzerland, but not regulated by Switzerland, and it has no supervision. There's no supervising body.
So the Bank for International Settlements appears to have a very controversial history. And specifically, before we get into kind of present day, I would like to stop a bit and talk about the World War II period. So during the World War II, as you wrote in the book, the BIS employed officers from the countries that were literally at war with each other. And so those officers sat under the same roof while their brothers, sons, their fathers literally were busy killing each other on the battlefield. So what I'm curious about is that just the greed of the business elite, since this is a private institution that is technically not regulated by an entity or a government, that made such a grotesque scenario possible? Or is there a better way to describe, to explain why that was actually possible during one of the worst wars in the history of humanity?
It's a very good question. It's one of the reasons why I looked at this institution, because it's also an example for a neutral actor, in the sense that the bank itself was able to function even during a big world war. Now, the reason why it's possible is first because the way it was set up, it was actually created with the idea that it should still be able to function even during times of war. That's part of its charter, actually, I think. Article 10 or something says, like, in times, the BIS assets and so on are inviolable, cannot be attacked, cannot be sequestered, cannot be taken away during times of peace or war. So this was already at the mind of these people, and then the sheer fact also that they were operating in Switzerland, which was also neutral, which then made it possible that people from these different countries could still travel to Switzerland and be there. And from what I read is that they didn't really like to meet each other anymore, but they were still working for the same cause, for regulating settlements among each other. And the thing is, among each other, I mean, one thing the Bank for International Settlement did as a matter of policy is that they said, we're not going to do settlements anymore between central banks of enemy countries. So the British Central Bank and the Japanese Central Bank, if for whatever reason, if they had a reason to want to do a settlement of a trade, then the BIS said, we're not going to do that. You are enemy countries. We are not going to try to aid and abet somehow trading with the enemy from either side. So we don't want to get into this mess. So we are not settling your accounts. But if the Japanese and the Germans, who were still friends, I mean allies, if you want to do a trade, then we'll work on that. And if the British and the Americans want to settle a trade, then we will do that. So we will work within the camps on both sides, because that's what we are here for. Because the institution is like, this is why we exist. So either we stop operations completely, or we continue operations, but we do take wartime measures, policies ourselves. And that they decided on the second one. I wouldn't say it's so much greed. It's more like, you have an institution that's supposed to do something, and the decision is, do we do that, and how do we do that under extreme circumstances? One of the most important things also for neutral countries is to understand that by the very nature that of your neutrality, you're not at war. The others are at war. They are fighting, and I don't like that. I mean, as a Switzerland in the First and Second World War, I have a okay relationship with the Germans. I have an okay relationship with the French. They're my friends. Sometimes they threaten me, but overall, I'm just sad that they're fighting with each other. But I mean, I want to continue with both of these guys. The idea then that trading with the Germans is evil, that was made up post facto, because we learned post facto, like, all of the evil. I mean, it was already known at a good part at the time and so on. And there's a big historical debate about guilt of trading with one of the two. But by virtue of right now, as we're seeing, trading with Israel, like, does that make you guilty? Now you might get a little bit more of the flavor of this. If you say yes, you might immediately be accused of anti-Semitism. If you say if you say no, you might immediately be accused of wanting to kill Palestinians, right? So it's that kind of problem that you then land in. But you have an existing relationship. You don't start it. It's just a question, what do you do with the existing relationship? Do you alter it, or do you not? And so the BIS decided to continue its business, but alter the policies to which it does.
And I think this is one of the kind of most controversial aspects as far as the BIS goes, because we know that one of the first presidents of the BIS was actually an American, and during the same time, former U.S. Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau even called for the BIS to be completely liquidated, and he felt so strongly about it because he thought that the BIS was actually collaborating with the Nazi Germany, that they were funding the Third Reich. And so he said that effectively this quasi-international entity without any moral or ethical constraints has no right to exist. And of course, that's kind of exactly what you just said, if we make a parallel to present day.
Precisely, and the Morgenthau is very interesting because Morgenthau was a hawk in many ways, and the guy who then became the governor of the BIS, I think McKinnick, I forgot his name, but he became the governor, the president of the central bank in 1940, and that was when the United States was still neutral. I mean, it was neutral until 41, right, officially, although it already supplied weapons and stuff, but we know the Americans do that now as well, but they still call themselves and not part of the war, which already happened back then. But they were officially neutral. You know, there were neutrality acts. The Americans at the time called themselves neutral. It's very interesting. The most important neutral country of the last 200 years is actually not Switzerland, it's the United States. It was neutral for 150 years, and that lasted until 41, until the Japanese bombed them out of it. So when he became president, he was still a representative of a neutral country, and then a year later, he basically transformed into like a national, a citizen of a belligerent. But he carried on his mandate very much the way that others would have expected, and in a quite neutral way. In terms, he felt more obliged to the goals of the bank of the BIS than of the war aims of his country, and that's something that Morgenthau hated him for. Morgenthau said, "You must not do trade. You must not enable trade with the Germans." And he said, "But we also enable trade with you, with the Americans." Yeah, but only the Americans, because the Americans are the good ones and the Germans are the bad ones. And it's always like that at war. That both sides will tell you the other one's is the baddie. Therefore, if you do anything with them, you're bad too. So stop it. And the neutrals always go like, "Holy Jesus, I just want to continue doing my thing."
So the BIS is a truly, I think it's such a unique entity, and it's no wonder that it's managed to maneuver through all these years in a way that now it's in a position to develop a framework for something that will completely transform the life of the humanity, because we will be in this new age where digital currencies will be our new, form of purchasing groceries or purchasing anything. And I think that is something that is really surprising to me, that this entity has managed to sort of survive through all of these years, through through the end of the First World War to up until now, and be in a position of power. And so to sum it up, the BIS is a global private financial organization, as you just mentioned. It's set up to withstand anything, peace and war, and that's included in its charter. It is not subject to external auditing, as you mentioned in your book. So that shows me that they really don't really have anyone to answer to. They're just basically guided by their own goals and interests, which means that there are no checks and balances in place, right? And the BIS has complete immunity from national laws and taxation. And that's just another aspect of the BIS that I think our viewers really need to be aware of. So yet this entity is the central bank for central banks. And so my question to you is, what role does politics play here?
It's very interesting. And you know, when we say there are no checks and balances, it's like there's no checks and balances in the way that national banks are regulated, which are regulated by the central authority, which is always the state, right? And then it makes the rules for everybody. But the BIS is regulated by its own members. And you know, it is not only the central bank for central banks, it's also the central banks made by central banks and of central banks. Its directors are usually the directors of the different member central banks, right? The membership in the BIS, if you want to become a member, you need to be a central bank. And there's only about, I mean, we have around 190 something countries in the world. Not all of them have central banks, most of them, but the BIS, if I'm correct at the moment, only has around 60 or so member banks. And these members then make up the directorate. What's interesting is, of course, that this means that there's no really higher state power over them. It is the different central bankers who run the show. That's why it's actually also very well insulated. And it's insulated from individual national politics by virtue of being constituted by the central bankers. And then it's not completely separate from it, but it is as well insulated as it gets. That's why it's very similar to the United Nations, which is not under one single country's control, but shared among them. The difference is that the BIS is not shared among the politicians. The BIS is shared among the central bankers, and central bankers tend to be different from politicians because they think more about finance and stability, financial stability, and less about politics, actually geopolitics. They think more about risk, and they try to mitigate risks.
Sure. And what countries exercise the most control over the BIS agenda, or the kind of you said that there is a think tank, effectively functions as a think tank, right? Where they get together and they discuss what course of action they need to be on in terms of economic development and financial development, CBDC development. So they obviously have those conversations, and that's how we see the framework being developed. And that's why we see so many countries that represent the majority of the global population actually pursue the development of CBDC simultaneously. When we see 130 countries go through the same stages virtually at the same time, it definitely shows us that there is a plan and everything is happening according to the plan. And the entity that's behind the plan is the BIS, because they're the ones who developed the concept of tokenization, right? And we will talk about that in just a minute. And CBDCs, and kind of they say, well, you know what, we are actually going to tokenize all assets, and that's how that will be the first sort of the beginning of easing people into the new reality. So it's truly interesting that there is the global entity, the BIS, that sits on top of central banks, and it has so much power to set direction for sovereign countries, right? Because they, of course, have their own economic agendas, but they seem to be very much aligned amongst themselves.
Well, I view the BIS a little bit differently in a way that I don't think that they sit and then they give directions. It's more like they are one part of a very much decentralized system of central banks and of other financial institutions that all work on something similar that very much has to do with the fact that the technology is now available. We have the technology now in order to do CBDCs and in order to do like digital currency, digital money. We didn't have that infrastructure 80 years ago. Although, let me just add one thing. During the Second World War, a lot of the transaction that did happen between in the camps and between, they already happened wirelessly via telegraph. So digital money, wiring money, is actually a very old technology. It's now almost 100 years old. But we now have the infrastructure to do that en masse, right? In a big way, and not just individually, like between little banks, between individual banks, but now it becomes possible to do it. And it's not just the central banks that do it. I mean, Bitcoin is very much a private initiative in order to create a private money, and this is really something that also proved to central banks and so on that there is possibility that something will emerge that will become money that is completely part of the private sector. And central banks and the BIS are not afraid of that. They work with that. I mean, this is just part of how 8 billion people on this planet interact with each other. And something that central banks and the BIS are very much concerned with is stability of the system. These people want, above all, that it doesn't collapse. And now introducing digital currencies, be they private, like Bitcoin, or be they centralized, like CBDCs, have a big risk of changing the way that that our economies work, because they might impact the way that people lend, that they borrow money to buy houses, and that will then include the entire mortgage industry and housing industry. And if that thing collapses, then holy matrimony. So this is the thing that they research at the moment, and right now we are actually in the research stage still. I mean, the BIS itself published an interesting paper, and we can look at that together, in which they show that they are also very unsure about how things will go, and they're still like developing different methods and frameworks that member banks central banks can then work with, whether if they want or not, not if they want to do so. If they want to do it differently, they do it differently, because the BIS has no decision-making power. They cannot say you have to do this or that. They can just offer services, and if the members say like, yeah, we want to use that, they do. If they don't want to do, they don't. And again, like only about 60 countries are member of the BIS. The others, they just don't participate because they don't want to. That's fine. The BIS still works for the ones that want to. And it's regulated again by its member banks. So, but I don't know, because you asked this good question, who controls it? Control has always been shared, but I don't know what the distribution of the different shares looks like. That's something that I would very much need to look into.